We are now going to delve into another important chat that's coming to the fore since the announcement of Donald Trump, of course, not attending the G20 Summit in South Africa later this year. And so as much talk has recently revolved around that, following South Africa, of course, now hosting the G20 for the first time come November, we are going to be turning our attention to the biggest story in terms of Africa, its chance to lead, and perhaps also look at some of the other issues, including, how debt relief, climate justice, digital sovereignty, and trade integration can be achieved. So we're going to weigh in, and for that, international relations analyst Lwazi Somya joins us virtually now. Lwazi, good morning, and thank you for your time on the SABC at this hour.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me.
So Lwazi, how can South Africa use the G20 presidency now to amplify the African Union's priorities, regardless of the fact that the US has now said Donald Trump will not be attending? Does Trump's absence actually free up the space for Africa and for the global South to drive the agenda without US dominance? How would you weigh in?
Well, we should all welcome Donald Trump inviting Vice President J.D. Vance for South Africa's G20, which clearly shows that the United States still holds the G20 as a very, very important multilateral platform. However, what you see in the early beginnings of the G20 process with Donald Trump's alterations concerning South Africa's G20 agenda, especially the theme, which is governed under solidarity, equality, and sustainability. This speaks against Donald Trump's domestic audience, where there's a pushback against notions around diversity, equality, and inclusion, which they call DEI. And part and parcel of this pushback is an international pushback on global reforms that America is trying to set. However, what you see now, South Africa placing the African continent at the center of the G20 processes, and along agenda setting some of the issues that we as African continent have been fighting about and contesting for all these years, clearly shows a gradual push that South Africa is trying to set that will take the African continent with it. However, what is very, very, very important is that the G20 itself is only 1 year. And therefore, what needs to happen following South Africa's presidency of the G20 is that there needs to be follow-ons in other multilateral fora, such as the African Union itself, and how do we now mobilize resources domestically to encourage intra-Africa trade, investment into infrastructure, and along with resolving some of the issues around debt. The other aspects is how do we push these issues around the World Trade Organization and how the sustainable reforms around the World Trade Organization will be necessary, and along with other UN bodies, such as the UN committees around debt and other issues around Africa.
Well, Lwazi, let's get further into that. I'm looking at the necessary interventions that are needed, and we're looking at the moment, how can we leverage to push harder for reforms of global financial institutions? That includes your IMF, your International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and this is in favor of what you spoke about, African representation, perhaps as it is enshrined in the theme for this year, right? But even if we're looking at the role that Pretoria should be playing in mediating between global North and South agendas, especially on issues like climate, debt, and digital governance that we're seeing take place in real time.
Yes, this is very important because South Africa is put in a very, very interesting situation where South Africa is the only African state within the G20, one with the first originators around BRICS, and along being involved with various other multilateral fora where South Africa places its voice upon. However, what we see now is that South Africa now is attempting to consolidate the global South voice during this G20 presidency and ensure that post this G20, these issues remain on the agenda. However, this G20 itself is insufficient considering that some of the issues will have to be resolved at continental level, which is very important in how now the African Union itself, with this new drive for African Union reform, integrates some of the issues that Africa is putting on the table. For example, the issues around critical minerals. South Africa is highlighting a very important point around the beneficiation and value-added mechanisms around the critical minerals that exist within the African continent. However, this is insufficient. As we have seen so far within the international community, and you look at the conflict in the DRC, and along with the Russia-Ukraine war, critical minerals have become the source of conflict and therefore part of peace agreements that the USA has been pushing in both peace agreements between the DRC and the one on Russia-Ukraine. And therefore, we need to be very conscious on how do we now frame these arguments around critical minerals, and how do we now ensure that in going in the future, Africa's position itself is not only just to sustain the critical minerals within the continent, but to prevent future conflicts emerging from these notions of critical minerals, resulting in a transition that is rolled with African blood, as we've seen what has happened with the critical minerals within the DRC.
Well, Lwazi, I mean, even if we look beyond, some of those issues that they come to the fore, and thank you for speaking to that, it's also an opportunity for Africa perhaps to use the platform to demand global attention on other issues, right? You've got peace and security issues that are coming to the fore. There's the Sahel region. There's the issues of the Red Sea as well. And these issues do get sidelined. So I wonder how this platform could be better leveraged to highlight that. But also, if we're looking at South Africa's diplomatic weight in the G20 at large, perhaps to position itself as a bridge builder between fractured global powers. Is there hope on that front to achieve that?
And yes, there's a lot of work concerning that front, especially when you look at the mechanism and how the G20 itself is constructed. Key to the G20 is consensus building amongst state actors. So there's no vote concerning the resolutions or declaration. It comes via consensus. And South Africa's ability to achieve that consensus will be tested, and how it builds bridges amongst these various 20 actors, along with the African Union and the EU, along with how do we now shape the future agenda setting of multilateral institutions utilizing the G20 process. The G20 is recognized as a premium economic fora for international issues, and it has become very useful in merging crises that emerged throughout history, from the 1990s financial failures to the early 2000s Wall Street and Wall Street crash, to even now the COVID-19 pandemic. Now an emerging issue around global debt is emerging, which impacts both global north and south. And South Africa can find bridges on how both the global north and south can come to a consensus on how we deal with these pressing issues. On issues around climate, there have been major stumbling blocks, especially concerning climate financing, in which those with resources have failed to meet the end of their own bargain in accordance to the Paris Climate Accord. And therefore, South Africa needs to hold the fire underneath everyone's foot concerning everyone's already committed agenda towards addressing the climate crisis. But we as an African continent also need to reflect and hold a mirror up to our faces. And what are we doing in terms of mobilizing domestic resources to address these very problematic and emerging crises in the international system?
Well, Lwazi, and this is obviously exploring opportunities that exist to diversify African trade partners at large, with other countries, China, the EU, India, Latin America even. Thank you for your time. Let's leave the conversation there. I know we're edging closer to November, and so these pertinent conversations obviously coming to the fore. Thank you for being part of just explaining the agenda setting initiative, obviously on the back of the dynamics unfolding here. Thank you to Lwazi Somya, international relations expert, weighing in following G20 Summit developments there.